thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. We are super excited to be hosting this Yoga Studies Symposium, celebrating 20 years of academic engagement. I'm Lucy May Constantini. I've recently finished a PhD at the Open University in the UK, and Daniela Bevilacqua is hosting and organising this with me. You'll hear a bit more about us later, so I won't go into details now. So just so you know, this is being recorded. I think you've heard an announcement as you come in, and it will be made available later online, and we'll get in touch with people to let you know how you can access recordings if you would like to. We encourage you to participate with questions. So the way we're going to structure each segment is Daniela and I will introduce the book authors and the discussants, and then they will, the discussants and authors will have about 20 minutes of explaining the book and raising some questions and discussing them, and then we'll open out questions to the Zoom room. So the way we would like you to engage with the questions is if you can send them in the chat, and when we're going to name a person. So it's Vicky Adenal for this morning. So when you look at the chat, you should see her name. Please send questions her way, and then we will unmute you and ask you to ask your question. If you don't wish to speak for whatever reason, just let us know and we can read out your question for you. So just type that in the chat as well. So hopefully that is clear for everyone. Now, we have a little timekeeping device, so just not to frighten anyone, but if you hear this, it's just a cue for whoever is speaking to start gently moving to the next section of their segment. So don't be alarmed if you hear a chime going off. It's not a fire alarm, it's a chime. And before I begin, I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to our production team, who are this morning Vicky Adenal, and we also have Ruth Westerby, Martha Henson, Jackie Hargreaves, and Vera Lazzaretti, who have been an incredible help and continue to be an incredible help. So thank you very much to them. And I think I've covered all the housekeeping. So without further ado, as people seem to like to say, I will hand over to Daniela.
Thank you, Lucy, and I'm very excited. So first, Daniela Bevilacqua here. I am affiliated with the University Institute of Lisbon, ISCTE-U. And first of all, I want to thank my research center, the Center of Research and Investigation in Anthropology, the CRIA, which provided the virtual structure and support, and also the South Asian Studies Circle and the Nucleus of Anthropology and Religion. So as you have seen in the description of the symposium, we want to celebrate and reflect on the current state of the art of the field of the yoga studies, 20 years after the publication of A History of Modern Yoga by Elizabeth de Michelis, the book which actually set the path for its development. So obviously, excellent works have been published before by authors who wanted to explore and unpack new topics and approaches in the study of yoga. So we can just mention the work of David Gordon White, who's here with us, The Chemical Body in 1996, Foyeston Georg with the yoga tradition and the deeper dimension of yoga. In 1999, we have the yoga tradition of Mysore Palace by Norman Sioman. And then in the same year of de Michelis' book, 2004, we have another groundbreaking work by Joseph Alter, Yoga in Modern India, the Body Between Science and Philosophy. And 1 year after, we have the book of Sarah Strauss, Positioning Yoga. So this scholarly interest tremendously expanded after Elizabeth de Michelis published a study on modern yoga and its various subcategories, because the book gave the input and the general theoretical substratum needed for the development of the field of yoga studies. And since then, more and more scholars from various disciplines and branches of knowledge have addressed their attention to yoga, yogic practices, and their resulting transcultural and transnational communities, often manifesting transdisciplinary approaches. And so this is evident when we consider the content of some relevant volumes published in the last decades. So we have 2005, the Theory and Practice of Yoga, edited by Knut Jacobsen. And in 2011, he also edited Yoga Powers. In 2008, we have Mark Singleton and Jane Byrne, with Yoga in the Modern World. And then David Gordon White edited Yoga in Practice in 2011. And in 2000, and then Singleton and Goldberg presented Gurus of Modern Yoga. And in the same year, 2013, Beatrix Osner edited Yoga Traveling. In the same year, Deborah Diamond published the Yoga, the Art of Transformation. And transformation is also the key term of another volume edited by Carl Bayer and Philip Maas, into Yoga in Transformation, Historical and Contemporary Practices. And recently we have in 2021, the Routledge Handbook of Yoga and Meditation Studies, edited by Karen O'Brien Kopp and Susan Newcomb. And these are just a few of the volumes. And then we have a number of monographs, countless. So just to mention a few that helped in reconstructing and framing the history of yoga and its various expressions and interaction with various contexts, we have, again, David Gordon White, Sinister Yogis in 2009. Then we can mention Carl Ernst, 2016, Refractions of Islam in India, situating Sufism and yoga. Then, of course, Mellinson and Singleton, Roots of Yoga. Then we have Patton Burchett, 2019, A Genealogy of Devotion, Bhakti, Tantra, Yoga, and Sufism in North India. And of course, looking at a more contemporary frame, we have Mark Singleton, Yoga Body. We have the work of Altglass, From Yoga to Kabbalah. Then we have Andrea Jain with Selling Yoga, From Counterculture to Pop Culture. Susan Newcomb, Yoga in Britain. We have Ian Baker, Tibetan Yoga. Theo Wildcroft, Post-Lineage Yoga, From Guru to Me Too. Amanda Lucia, White Utopias. And then Anya Fox and Inhaling Spirit. Then we have Julian Struber, Global Tantra, and Stuart Starbuck, Tracing the Path of Yoga, and so on. So you can see that the amount of study has been like a lot. Lucy.
So I'm exhausted just hearing about all of that. So as you can see, there's a lot, and that's
so much to read.
Iceberg, yeah, exactly. It's a lot to read. So we've got plenty to keep us busy. And so because of this, we've decided to organize the symposium focusing on the most recent work. So we just made a decision to look at works published between 2022 and 2024. So it's an arbitrary distinction just based on time. We're really lucky that we've got 14 incredible authors and also 14 incredible discussants who accepted to participate in this. And we're also really grateful to people for bearing with the online format. It is accessible, it is convenient for dropping in and out, but it is quite demanding on attention. So we recognize that. We've scheduled breaks accordingly, and we really appreciate your presence with us. And we're super happy to begin with Elizabeth de Michelis. So Elizabeth de Michelis returned to university in the 1990s, having previously trained in translation and modern languages, and then worked in business administration. She obtained a doctorate in religious studies at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, and then went on to pursue a mainly research-focused career in the UK, mainly Oxford and Cambridge universities. Her focus was the history and transmission of ideas, with special reference to the transmission and spread of yoga in modern globalized contexts. Now, since her retirement, her focus of, as she says, non-professional interest has shifted to a critical observation of how forms of belief are both cultivated and manipulated in contemporary societies, and on how such beliefs influence social constructs and individual behaviors. So my first question for Elizabeth, other than to say welcome and thank you for joining us, is to ask, what is it that brought you to this subject in the first place? So what was it that influenced you, and what were your aspirations when you began?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lucy and Daniela, for inviting me and for honoring my book. Because to be sincere, I mean, the work you've put together for these 2 days is really excellent. And I'm so glad to participate and to start the thing rolling in memory of my book. I was quite surprised when you invited me, because I had not realized that 20 years had gone past. So that's quite something. And as Daniela very well demonstrated, the field of yoga studies has really blossomed. It's true that my contribution is really in putting together the modern and the ancient. And as Lucy hinted, what I realized also thinking, preparing a little bit, going back over my life and my academic life over the last few days, what has really fascinated me is the link between belief and behavior, ideology, and how one then applies it in life. So there is an existential dimension for me that is the key one that interests me, between the intellectual and the theoretical and the practical. And that's also how I came to yoga and to my study of yoga. Like many modern yoga scholars and many yoga scholars, I came to it through practice, which I think several of you have made studies about that. And it has become apparent that, differently from other fields, the practitioners are more present. Some people don't like that very much. I think it's a good thing, because it connects real life and intellectual life, which is not a bad thing in my books. Anyway, I came to it because when I was 19, I started practicing yoga. And it was a sort of yoga that Suzanne describes in Yoga in Britain. So it was housewife yoga. It was very relaxed. And well, there were all sorts of social things going on, which I won't get into. But after a few years of practice, I did like it a lot. So it became a constant in my life. And however, I could not go deep enough. That I started feeling that I wanted to understand more the practices, the theories behind what was going on. And what does one do in such instances? You go to the source. So I went to India, which was very interesting. And looking back on it, I realized that, in fact, I experienced both nationalist yoga, not both, nationalist yoga, modern yoga, the more postural styles. Yes, and the more commercial postural styles, but also hints of more traditional yoga. I had some insights. So when I went quite young on this trip in India, in a way, I had a bit of a taste of everything, but I didn't have any means to go deeper again. And really, differently from others, I was not really caught by the local thing. Either it was me not being suitable, or I did not find the right channel. So I ended up thinking that, well, I'm a Westerner, so I'll go back and study with Western tools, which as an intellectual meant university. So I did a master at SOAS, first in religious studies, Indian religious studies, and then that went on to the PhD at Cambridge. And about my influences and aspirations, my aspiration was to understand what was going on in modern yoga, essentially. And after the master, I could start to label the Indian contents. What I found in modern yoga were echoes of the Indian contents. Echoes that could be quite strong and quite powerful, but echoes. So, I could tell that it wasn't really the main thing. However, the other thing was much more mysterious. What was going on? What were all these more modern contents that came up? Science, or obviously modern ideas. So that's, I focused on that. And the key, well, at first I thought I would have to write about yoga, what I imagined to start with from the 50s, 60s onwards, the latest decades. But then as I dug into the history, I could follow the thread of the ideology, which was taking me further and further back into the 19th century. And that's why the first part of my book is all about the 19th century, sorry, the 19th century, I meant. The 19th century context of Indian esotericism, which was very influenced by the West. So there is this cross dialogue between India and Anglophone ideology. And it's there that I found the roots of modern yoga and started connecting things. A key influence there was a book by Hanegraaff, New Age, what is it called? The New Age Religion and Western Culture, Esotericism in the Mirror of Secular Thought, very telling title and subtitle. And that's really the one that gave me the key to understand the other side, not the Indian ecos, which in a way were more straightforward because that had been studied very well, but the Western content, how it had been absorbed into modern yoga. Here, I would like to honor my influencers and my instructors, my teachers, which were 3 at SOAS during my master. And sadly, they've all passed away now. Julia Leslie, Alexander Piatigoski, and John Marr. With Julia Leslie, she covered in a wonderful way the whole of Hinduism. For us, students, Alexander Piatigorsky was a rather mad philosopher, a Russian philosopher, and his classes were real fun and very challenging intellectually. They really destroyed a lot of presuppositions we had, so they were really excellent. And John Marr was a total delight. He was a Tamil scholar. I think he was born in India, very, very into the culture, fluent in Tamil, fantastic art historian. So that with all those different elements, it really allowed me to get in only 1 year a very, very contextualized picture of India and Indian traditions, of which I was rather ignorant. So that was an excellent foundation. And at Cambridge, I would like to honor, well, Julius Lipner was my mentor, mainly in the administration and politics, but his classes were also wonderful. And as a scholar of Bengal and modern Hinduism, that helped me a lot. I studied Sanskrit with Ivan Kars and John Smith, but as we all know, Sanskrit study is never enough. You always need more somehow. But anyway, it was great to study with them. And most of all, I should honor my PhD scholar. She's also passed away, unfortunately. I think I might have been her last student, so she had a lot to give. Sita Narasimhan, she was completely bicultural, of Indian birth, from a Brahmin, but she had kind of transferred completely to the UK, also culturally, as it were. And she had impeccable both Sanskrit and English literature training. Not only that, she had studied in her young days, studied and worked yoga work with Tirumalai Krishnamacharya. So she really knew what I was studying from the inside. And with me, she helped me to work out what was going on. So it was, serendipitous that I ended up working with a supervisor like that, because it couldn't have been better. And of course, you can imagine that the Cambridge environment was fantastic in terms of discussion and cross-pollination of ideas and so on. So yes, that was my aspiration, to understand the link with the theory and practice and the 2 contexts, the Sanskritic, Indian, and so on, and the Western or Anglophone, with a bit of Italy and France mixed in. And yes, and I'm very glad to honor my teachers because they were wonderful and the book wouldn't have come about without it. And my mind wouldn't have been the same without them.
Yeah, I can imagine that, Elizabeth, because sometimes the supervisor are, you know, the guru for developing everything we eventually come up while researching and writing. So I have a question for you, is like about the book. Indeed, did you foresee the influence the work had?
No, that's an interesting question. I didn't, for two main reasons. One was that I was so absorbed into my topic that I didn't think about anything else. You know, when you find a research that you really love, it becomes consuming, it destroys families, it does all sorts of things. So it's kind of, yeah, I think most of you will know what I'm talking about. But the other thing, which is more historical, and it might be interesting to point it out, is that as I was to come into the completion of my work around the year 2000, there was a lull in yoga practice and in yoga milieus. And I thought, oh my God, maybe I'm studying a dying subject. You know, I will, yeah, okay, I will, you know, it's a story of this world that is going to fade gently into, you know, one of the various cultural things. But that was about 2000. And as some of you will remember, the Ashtanga crowd came in, you know, jumping onto the scene, sort of very athletic, 20 years old and so on. And I mean, there were all sorts of other things going on, but in the UK, where I was, that became real apparent. And whereas I had been studying milieus where people were middle-aged and so on, and the ideas also were a little bit, you kept hearing the same things being repeated, and this whole new wave started, and it brought in new life and the new dynamic. So I said, well, no, maybe it's not dying, maybe it's continuing. And we could say, again, I was thinking about this presentation or this question and answers session. And we could say, you remember in my book, there were the popularization, consolidation, and acculturation phases. And I was thinking, well, what could we call this new phase, which I have not written about because it happened after the book. And we could perhaps label it as a full assimilation period, assimilation. It was not, yoga was not countercultural anymore. It was not even exotic anymore. It had really become completely assimilated in the culture. Now we are into a third phase, arguably. And I've been on and off talking with Mark about it. So I think he's been thinking about it, Mark Singleton. I think he has been thinking and working about this. And I would be very curious to hear about it because I think it's an interesting phase, which we could say that the assimilation goes from the 2000 to 2020. These phases seem to go into generational 2 decades slots, periods. And this latest one, I was thinking how we could call it, just for a joke, a phase of virtual virtuosity, because it's all virtual and it's very virtuous in the sense of performance. How virtuous it is in a more socio-ethical terms, I'm not so sure. It would be very interesting to see how Eastern in general, and especially yoga and meditation's ideas, have influenced the GAFAM, you know, the Google, Facebook, and so other crowd. That's very interesting because, of course, that's not the whole story, but this injection of modernized, reinterpreted, more or less, Indian religions into the contemporary technological, technocratic world. It would be interesting to work out what kind of influence it has had. As many of you will know, Steve Jobs' livre de chevet, favorite book, which he distributed to all and sundry, was Autobiography of a Yogi. So, you know, for such an influential person, that's interesting to note.
Wow, thank you, Elizabeth. That's very wide-ranging and it's given me a lot to think about. So we're on the last 5 minutes of this little segment. So yeah, it has been very full. So I don't know if we can do this quickly, but let's try. So a few weeks ago, many of us who are, I think, on this call were at the Yoga Darshana Yoga Sadhana conference in Hamburg. And one of the things that struck me there is how rich and how many scholars there are in this community. Like there's so much going on, it's impossible to follow it all. But none of that actually existed when you were starting. So what we were wondering is like, what disciplines, what communities of scholars and so on supported your process as you were starting your research? And on the other side, did you come across criticism or people who thought it wasn't such a great idea? What was your experience of that?
I did not, I can't think of any criticism. I can think about a lot of very constructive criticism that people offered on specific points of my research whenever I presented it or discussed it around cups of tea or meals or walks or whatever it was, which are the best moments, by the way. No, I cannot think of any particular, and also nobody, I think people were quite, they could see that there was something to say in the field, and so no. But as for the disciplines, a lot of support, and the disciplines I studied were, well, Sanskrit and Sanskrit culture, which goes together, because Sanskrit ideology and culture, because the language is not enough, you need to know, to have the wider picture, to be able to hang the terminology and so on. History, of course, the history of religions, but also the broader, sociological, historical context that I was studying, and anthropology and sociology. I think that's probably the disciplines that I found most useful, and I found great support everywhere. One beautiful thing that perhaps I will mention is the sorority and the support that I felt from either older or senior female scholars. I don't know whether that is still felt nowadays in academia, but in my days, you could really feel that people of the age of my supervisor, for example, she was near retirement, they had really had to fight to assert themselves in a mainly male dominated environment, and they were very protective and supportive towards younger female scholars. So that was wonderful to feel, and I want to acknowledge that as well. In Oxford, I had several dealings with Ursula King and Peggy Morgan, and also what she was called, Sanjukta Gupta. So it was really wonderful to feel that kind of support, which was not only friendly, it was also academic. So I would like to acknowledge that as well. Great chance to acknowledge my teachers, which I don't think I've ever done officially. So there it goes.
I appreciated hearing about them. Thank you for sharing all of that. I didn't know, so it's really wonderful to hear. We're on our last minute. Daniela, do you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of questions for you, but yeah, maybe a last one, a few more minutes. A question could be, is there anything in the development of yoga studies after a history of modern yoga that surprised or pleased you?
What surprised me in a very positive fashion was, as you mentioned, the introduction, the wealth of scholarship that happened. I don't think thanks to my book, I hope my book was helpful, but I think the times were ripe as well. Regarding my book, what did surprise me positively was that some of the terminology I proposed, which sounded very strange to me and odd when I first developed it, then actually got adopted, like modern postural yoga or the phases, or even modern yoga. We discussed a lot about whether to call it modern yoga or not. So, and in the beginning, nothing happened with the book. And I said, "Ooh, you know, academic book, 10 people will read it, and then it will stay on the shelf gathering dust." And then I could see through the sales that, you know, every 6 months, every 6 months, the book kept selling. And it still keeps selling more or less steadily, which that was really surprising to me. But it means it's useful, you know, which it was very useful to me, and I'm very happy that it's useful to others.
Yeah,
So
and
yes, of things of yoga studies, the expansion of yoga studies surprised me very pleasantly, and also the way my book was received, because you know, it confirms that I probably said some interesting things somewhere.
I mean, and that's why, I mean, we have it published in Italian, will be out in July.
Thanks to you and to your efforts as a translator.
Yeah, because I really think it's very useful, especially in different environments like the Italian one. Yes.
Okay, sadly we have, well, sadly and not sadly, we have to move on. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was incredibly rich.
You're welcome. Thank you again for inviting me and for honoring my humble book.